Okay. Hopefully that will work. Yeah, I'll let the Seattle people call in and see if... Okay, that's good. All right, sorry for the technical difficulties. Yeah, we always have some glitches every time I do this, but hopefully we figured out some sort of mechanism so I could do recording in the future. Most likely I'm going to invest in some sort of a camera system. Yeah.
The recording is on, right?
Yeah, the recording's on, so I'm just going to use my phone to record, and if Seattle comes in, they could just listen in and hopefully they listen in. All right, today we're going to talk about Revit basic family creations. Some of you guys, you probably dealt with families at one or the other. Today, my attempt is that we just want to get into the basic stuff. So if you don't understand how family works, that's fine. I'm just going to explain to you very simple terms. This is not going to be very advanced stuff. In the future, I probably will do an advanced topic for those who are interested. All right, let's get started. So you probably dealt with a lot of the Revit content. You see, like, you know, all this furnitures and stuff like that. The unfortunate thing is that Revit families can be very, very difficult to build, right? It's not like, you know, a SketchUp where you just push and pulls and do whatever you want, but Revit is kind of like, you kind of have to take a mold and then you kind of have to apply void to it and then you have to cut and do all that stuff. And to me, it's a very weird ways of modeling. All right, some of the things inside the Revit families. You have three things. One is the system families, one's the in-place, and then the most common one we use is the component. System families are basically like if you have floors, roof, ceilings, those are components. Those are built inside the project itself. In-place families basically like if you are doing them one of, you know, it's let's say if you have something that you cannot be built, then it's going to be within the project. Perfect example would be like in Revit, it doesn't have a 3D property line. So what we do is that we do in-place families, just draw like a property line in 3D, so when you cut, it shows up. Component families is going to be basically, everybody's going to be using the component families. Component families allows, it's like, if you think about dynamic AutoCAD blocks, it's the same thing. So basically it's called the in-place families, a load of families. Okay. Family types. So there are four types. The most common one's going to be the model and annotations, and you're going to have another one called the details. Now, the difference between the annotation details is that one is scale. When you change the, let's say, the drawing units, okay, it automatically scale for you. Whereas the detail is going to be basically one-to-one. Okay, whenever you put in, let's say, gypsum wallboard detail, it's always going to be at this one scale. Model is going to basically, it's just a 3D component, and what you can do is that when you put it in, it's going to be real objects, and it's going to have plan section elevations built in. Okay. Now finally, there's a hybrid one called the grids and levels. Okay, this is basically hybrids of 3D and 2D. The objects will not display in 3D, but shows up in multiple views. Now that has changed in 2019. Because what happens is that in 3D views, you are now able to turn on levels. But they're still working on turning on the grids for the future as well, so that's still in works. But in most cases, this is the type of the families that you're going to be encountering. Some of the terms that you may noticing, okay, one is the categories. Okay, what category does is that Revit has a lot of categories. So you have like air terminal, you have ducts, you have structural columns, you have etc. Those are categories. Family types, what happens is that within a family, there are family types. So what family type does is that if you have a door and you have 2'6" door, you have 3'6", those are called family types. So you're going to have different types of door based on that. There is another two properties. So basically there's instance property and there's a type properties. So instance properties, basically you can override it any way you want it. Okay? it basically contain that information. Basically, like when you place the family, you can just say, I want to stretch this door out 3 feet, and then it will basically make it 3 feet. Type properties is basically, it's within that type. Okay, so just the basic stuff. So basically, when you create an information, if you put in an information in there, let's say if you put in that door is blue, then all the door, when you put it in, let's say 3-foot door, is going to say blue. Okay. Whereas instance parameter is just basically just like one of. Like, so if you're building something that is unique, let's say this door is going to have red that has like blue color and stuff like that, just as a one of, then you use the instance parameter. But for type, it's going to be happening to all the doors. So that's what it means. All right, I know some of you guys are familiar with AutoCAD. Okay, what's the difference between Revit families? I won't go too deep into it because I know that a lot of people, they're not into AutoCAD anymore, but this is kind of like the parameter, like what's the difference between AutoCAD. The only difference is that Revit families will work in 3Ds and 2Ds, whereas AutoCAD is just strictly in 2D mode. That's pretty much it. When you build a families, sometimes what you have to do is that you have to refer to the reference plane and reference line. Okay, those are basically what happens that when you create skeletons, I always use the reference plane. Okay, that way when the parameter changes, it always stretches that reference plane. You can do it to the model itself. You can basically say, okay, this reference this, and then I want this to do this, but you have to be careful because sometimes it will break. Okay, I much prefer to reference it to the reference plane or reference line. Okay. Now, the only difference between the two, reference plane and reference line, is that reference line is used for rotations, whereas reference plane just goes infinite. So it's good if you have like a solid, let's say XY direction, then just use the reference plane. Okay, that's pretty much it. Now, whenever I do families, I always have to say plan your family first. Like first you have to ask yourself, what kind of objects you want, okay? If you have an object that has one specific size, that you know that it's gonna be just one of, right? It's not gonna have too many size, then you don't need parameters, okay? The less parameter you put in, the better, because Revit file size, or especially the family, would determine how many parameters you have. Okay, the less parameter, the lighter the model is going to be. A perfect one size would be, let's say if you have a tree with a specific size, then yes, you don't need to put it in. Now, if you have objects with multiple size, then you have to add a parameter. Perfect example would be door. So door, you have 3 foot, 2 foot, 2'6", whatever. So that is an object that you need parameter for. Okay, and the next question I would ask is that, do the object needs to display in a single multiple view? What it means is that when you put it on a plan, is it going to show up? And if you put it on elevation, does it want to show up? So those are kind of the plan that, when I built families, that's what I'm looking for. So if it's only shows in single view, let's say if you want to display it on plan section, etc., then you can get away with detailed component families. Okay. Now, if you want to show it in multiple views, okay, then it has to be a model family. Now, if you want to display in plan section, but drafting or sheets, anything with sheets, you have to be in annotation families. That's the only difference. Detailed component cannot go on sheets, only annotation can. Okay, so that's some sort of a rule that you just have to follow. Okay, the next question is that does the family needs to be in 2D or 3D? So when you're working on larger projects, 2D objects, if it only shows up in two-dimensional, it's fine to use 2D because you basically reduce the file size if you just introduce 2D. The minute you have to go 3D, that basically increases your file size. That's pretty much happening in pretty much any program. So it's kind of charting. I do have like a write-out of this, so you guys can follow. Okay, so I'm just gonna probably send it to you guys after this presentation. So if it's only shows only in plan and levels multiples elevation, like then use the 2D model line, and then if there's a single elevation, use 2D symbolic line. Levels with multiple step. Okay. And multiple views, presentation, use 3D model, and an object requires construction documentation, requires cut. Now, I just get into it. Basically, it's like step by step and saying that do you need this, do you need this? If you don't need it, then use this. And then if you need it, then use that. So basically, just step by step what you need. Now, also, families has a special properties, okay? Certain family categories will cut in section, and some of them will not. So these are basically families that you can cut in section. So doors, curtain panels, generic, massing, structural columns, architectural columns, structural frame, and windows. Now, once you get into this, only doors and windows allow symbolic to show when cut, so you can actually put it in. What it means is that you have that 2D swing, right? That's a symbolic. So what happened is that if you cut at certain levels, you can hide those 2D lines so that it doesn't show up. Okay, this happens a lot when you're doing more like, okay, you want to show the model at level 2 and then you're showing the door at level 1. Sometimes what happens is that if you don't have this option turned on, it will show that door swing at level 1 on level 2. So sometimes it confuses people. So what I typically tell people to do is that if you have this, it means that if your model shows up level 2 and you have like show depth like level 1, then that door swing will not show up. So that's what it does. All right, sometimes what happens is that, Revit can't do everything, okay? So you probably require some sort of AutoCAD insert into your Revit model. In some instances, it's fine. Perfect example would be if you have like a manufacturer's windowsill that is very, very detailed and Revit can't do it, okay? Revit can do it, but the problem with the Revit is that it has a limitation. The detail component, if it reaches less than 1/32 of an inch, okay, that's like 1.5 or 1 millimeters, then it just will not work. It will not draw your line. So that's where AutoCAD comes in play, okay? Because AutoCAD, you can scale stuff, you can draw as tiny as possible, it still shows up, right? In Revit, just that's the limitation, okay? It's just the software limitation. The other thing I did, most cases, is that if you have a very complicated geometry that you cannot build inside Revit, then I would refer to use outside source like AutoCAD or SketchUp and then just insert in those objects. Because Revit has a very finicky when it comes to like a smooth curve and all that stuff. It doesn't like to do it too much. It likes to represent objects as, this is the object. It's not a modeling model. It's not like a real 3D modeling software. It is basically a BIM database kind of a software. Okay, just to keep in mind. Okay, family visibility control. So everyone has ability to basically control what visibility they want of the models. Okay, so what you can do is that you can do the add on and off parameters. Visibility. And so what happened with the visibility is that you can specify how your families wants to behave when you, let's say, put it on plan, section, elevation. And sometimes it has this when cut in plan and RCP. Now, you can only get this option if you choose these objects, okay? So most of the time, if it's like mechanical, electrical objects, that option will get grayed out. Okay, just a couple things to keep in mind. You can also control how your objects want to display, whether you want to display in coarse, medium, or fine, or you want to display all the time in all those 3 modes. So in one instance, the coarse, let's say for example, you have a table, right? For the coarse, you probably show just a box, right? Once you go to medium, you probably want to show like the table with the legs, and then once you get into finer detail, you probably want to show the the router ring and all that stuff. So that's where we get those 3 modes: coarse, medium, and fine. Okay, it is useful in certain cases because what happened is that when you're doing a fine model in a larger context, sometimes you don't care about how fine the detail. All you want is just the coarse, just the box, just to represent that object. Family subcategories. Okay, so what I like about this is that sometimes family subcategory you can basically break up your components into pieces. So rather than using some sort of special filters and all that stuff, you can add a subcategory inside Revit. For this case, I have like a stop sign. Within that stop sign, I could say, okay, subcategory, I want to just basically say, okay, make that as a whole. Okay? Once you load that family into your project, what it does is that it will add that subcategory into the list. Now, this is a good way because you could say, okay, for all the stop sign, just turn it off rather than turning off all the site components, okay? And then this is kind of like one step instead of doing the filtering, because sometimes you can use filter to filter things out, but that requires a lot more steps versus this, you can just say turn things off, okay? Just another way to do it. All right, let's go demonstration. All right, so when you first start out with families, okay, here's all the components, okay? Let's start out with the generic model. Now, in here, there is a couple of, generic model has the most kind of like the template is because each of them represents some sort of a template that you could use. There's wall base, two-level base, roof base, pattern base, line base, etc., etc. Now, when you, let's say I'm gonna just use the generic model, let's say hit open. I won't talk about the other, I'm just gonna go the most simplest. Within this model, what you have is that you have this two buttons. This is the family type. You can create a bunch of parameters in here. The one thing that you wanna keep in mind is that if, let's say you made a mistake of choosing the wrong template, you can always go back here and say, okay, I'm gonna change it to a furniture template, which is good. Now, you have to be careful with, because whenever you create a template or choose a template, for instance, if I go new, family, and if you choose one of this, floor base, face base, anything with some sort of a base, right? You're basically stuck in that mode. You cannot change it and say, oh, later on, I don't want this to happen. I don't want this to be, you know, not hosted to a wall. You're too late. So just keep in mind. Okay, because most of the time I would recommend user, if you want to start with the template, is that do not add anything like, you know, hosted on something, because what happened is that if your wall, roof, or whatever, if you delete that object also automatically deleted. Okay, that's one thing that to be careful with, because I know that sometimes people like to host stuff on wall. Let's say, for example, that little electrical outlet, let's say they want to host it on a wall. If that wall has disappeared, that thing also disappear. Okay, so what mechanical or electrical likes to host our objects on our wall, architectural wall, and that's the danger. I always tell the electrical, make sure that you don't host it, because once that wall gets deleted from our architectural, sometimes they may miss that electrical outlet. So it's good that you have this conversation early on, or else they just do it and then they don't see your changes, and then that outlets disappear. Okay, just be careful, because that could happen. Now, the only time you want to use, let's say, hosted objects is when you're doing a slope and you want a certain object to host on a slope, then you could do that. Okay, because what happened is that generic model, it's only going to host it on a level, or if you say specify that object to a level, that's fine. But once you say you want it to be on any surface, for instance, let's say you want a light to host on, let's say, a ceiling, a wall, or a floor, etc., then you use what's known as the face base. You could use floor and other stuff, but I like the face base because it could be anything. It could be ceiling, could be floor, it could be roof, or it could be walls. Okay, so when you build a family that you want to host to something, use face base, because it's more flexible that way. Okay. All right, let's get started with this. Now, one thing I forgot to mention is that when you do let's say a door. Okay, I'm gonna do. Let's start with the door first, because I have something I have to kind of talk about in the door first. Okay. In a door, it's automatically going to be hosted on a wall itself, okay? Now, there is a parameter. Let's say, for example, I'm going to draw one in right here. Now, sometimes what happens is that when you're doing a project, you want that wall to kind of like return in whenever you cut into, let's say, the door. So this is a hidden features that not a lot of people know, is that you can actually specify that. Now, first, when you draw it in, I always like to put it in a reference plane. Just first draw a reference plane, and then next you want to draw in your dimensions. And in here, what you can do is select the dimensions, and you click on this button right there, create a parameter. In here, I'm just going to say wall closure offset. Let's say, just give it a descriptive. You could say x1, x2, x3. That's fine if you understand what that means. But for most cases, if you're building a family, I always like to be very descriptive so that user understand what that means. Because most cases, I get like a lot of the parameters. Excuse me. I'll put a lot of parameters, x, y, y1, and then all that stuff, and then I have no idea what that does. Just be aware of. Now, once I added that in, okay, there's an option in here. You see that there is a one called the wall closure. If I click that on, okay. Now, you have another one, weak reference, strong reference, and not a reference. So what this does is that whenever you align certain objects, this will determining which object's going to get picked first. If you say strong reference, that object will always get picked first. Whereas if you put not reference, it means that it's not referencing to anything. Okay, keep in mind. There's also subcategory as well. Right now I don't have anything, so that's okay. Now, define origin, something to be careful with. If you say that this is defining origin, which means that you see that right now when I select that object, it says that it's a defining origin. And I think this one, no, it's not this one. I think it's the back side. No. Yes, one of these objects is, if it says there's a defining origin, it means that that's the 0, 0 point. Okay, something to keep in mind, but useful information. So now when I put in that wall enclosure, I'm just going to go new project. Let's go architectural. I'm going to draw a wall. Okay, let's say you pick one with the brick with the CMU. Okay, and I'm just going to put in a fine detail. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to load that family 2 into the project. Now, I defined that wall closure. Okay, what that does is that right now you're not seeing anything until I hit this do not wrap and say wrap it at the exterior. Okay, when I hit OK, you notice that there's some jump in there. So if I define this even further and say this is 200, okay, wall closure offset, what it does is that it basically pushed that wall enclosure into the interior wall. Okay, so you can do that. You can define this how much you want to return by adding that little value there. Okay, it's one of those hidden kind of feature inside Revit that not a lot of people know about. So here I'm just going to talk to you like if you have that, that's good. Now, how does it look like in model? That's what it looks like. So basically, it will look correctly. Okay, so basically, it just wraps it in. Okay, if you want to wrap it even further, then you basically tell the door to go further in. So you can say, okay, I want to go full one meter. Let's see what there you go. It just basically goes all the way through. All right, this is good if you're doing a lot of detailing. Okay, if you have a detailing kind of a thing, this is a perfect way to do it. Any questions so far with this? Pretty self-explanatory, right? All right, let's getting back to the generic model family. Well, in case you missed it, I was explaining that inside when you do a door or windows, there is a parameter in there that you can actually call Revit to basically do the wrap around the wall. So in here, what I did is that I just select that reference plane and say wall enclosure, and then when I go into the project, let's say if I wanted to find this door and have the wall closure offset, let's say 500. Oops, too much. Let's say 200. There you go. So basically, it controls the wrap. Okay, you can do that inside the door or window family. Okay, it's one of those hidden features that nobody knows. All right, the next thing I'm going to talk about is like, how do you build like a simple family? I talked about like, if you want to change the family, just click on this and say generic model and just say, okay, let's build a furniture family. Now, one of the things I want to do is that I always tell people to always draw a reference plane. Now, I always give it a number. So let's say this is 400. On the opposite side, I also put in like 400 as well. Now, if you want this to stretch equal distance to each other, I would usually say pick this center line and basically just go into the, the two outer edges and say equal. Okay? And what happens is that right now you can say, okay, that one is 800. And here, I'm just going to say this is the width. Now, by default, it's going to set to type parameters. Okay? You can select that thing, and then you can hit this instance parameter if you need to. Make that instance parameter. Now, if you want to make it stretch, you see that right now, I just stretch it, it automatically flexes. Okay? You will always want to test it out, just in case. Okay? All right, let's do it the other way. Okay, let's do it this way as well. Again, I always start it with a defined offset. The reason why you want to do that, rather than saying, oh, make this like that and then press equal, what will happen is that you will shift the origin point. That's the very dangerous thing if you're doing a family. So whenever you do it, that's kind of like my my tips is that always make it equal. So if this is 300, make that 300, so that you do not want to shift this 0, 0. Because there's a chances if you put in that thing and then this is like some other weird number, and if you hit that equal, this offset will shift and then it will screw up your family when you load it in. So it's one of those things that a lot of the new user that's want to build family doesn't understand. Because once that offset is shifted, sometimes what happens is that your door no longer has that origin point, and then you kind of have to figure out calculation-wise what's the offset, and then you counterbalance it. It's a very messy process. So I'll just say if you want to keep it consistent, do it like this. Okay.
Can you pin down one of the reference planes if you don't want that to happen?
You can. I think by default this is pinned.
Oh, it's already pinned.
Yeah,
it still moves.
It still moves.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's the danger about this. I built one family. It was it's the same thing. That was my mistake, rookie mistake, and then after that,
Yeah.
never to do it again. Right?
Yeah, I see a lot of the families. Most of us around the office are pretty much rookies with family building.
Yes.
So some of the families we end up with in our projects are, they're just like rough, kind of like do the best we can as we go.
Right. That's
and
right.
I wonder, like, should we have, if like, because now we're bringing in families from other projects that have these weird things going on.
Yes.
Like, is there a process where we should just like have you review our families before it starts getting used?
That's always the case. Yeah, that's my job, right?
Yeah.
My job is just to look at people's family and see if it's good or not. Because one of the major things is that when I built families, I thought about what's going to happen. Let's say the user's going to usually ask me certain things that, oh, I want this, I want this, I want this, and I always know what people want. And there is some cases where people want some sort of extra stuff built into it. So I kind of take that into consideration as well. I think one of the project, I think it's the Lily Lake, you work with Agnes or something, has that railing. Mm-hmm. She wants to customize it so that the edge corner looks certain ways. But I'm using one family that represents...
I noticed that. It's like a system family now.
It's not a system. It's just one panel, curtain wall panel. And what it does is that it does multiple functions. So that's kind of like the idea. Like you give me an idea, I'll build it in. Mm-hmm. So I'll use one family and then just build upon that. All right, so once you have that, then you add a family. I always like to be very descriptive, right? So if it's a length, call it the length. Don't call it an XY, right? So I have a lot of XY. Now, you can actually, let's say for example, if the width is 200 and you want the length to be half of that, what you can do is that, the nicest thing about Revit is that you can actually put in a formula. So you could say, if my width is 200, I want the length to be equal, like half of that. Okay, so you could do that, okay, and then hit apply. Right now it says that no, I cannot do it because I forgot to do something. I forgot to change this to instance parameter. So instance parameter will only works with instance parameter, but sometimes you can make it work. But I would just say if it's an instance parameter, this is the instance parameter will always display that default value, that parentheses default. It means that it's an instance parameter. So in here, I'm just going to say OK, and now it works, and say OK. Now if I stretch this, let's say if you want to flex the muscle, all right, it does it for me. Great job. Okay, so that's how you kind of like slowly build your family. Okay, again, I'm just going to go in here and then just put in my height. So I'm just going to say, OK, that's my height. And say this one, I'd say make it 900 and just put in height.
Is it useful to name your reference planes too?
In certain cases, no, but if it's a simple one, don't bother. But if it's a very complicated where you have thousands of different reference planes, yes, that's when I do it. Okay, it's a good idea.
Keep track of what's what.
Yes, exactly. But once it gets too complicated, I would just say build it out. Like that's gonna be like the advanced stuff, right? I probably will talk about that in the future, like what to do if there's like too many reference plane and how do you handle that. Okay, so right now you have a very simple stuff. So here what I can do is I'm just gonna draw a box. Okay, draw a box. Okay, that's good. All you have to, you don't have to lock anything. All you have to do is just basically reference to those reference plane. And what happens is that when you stretch this out, see that it follows with it. Okay, simple thing. Once you built your skeleton, everything just falls in play, and you just have to basically just trace that. Now, the next thing you want to do is that extrusion end. Now, here, what I can do is that you can just go in here and say, okay, I want to stretch it and then just pin it. Okay, just force it up and just say pin it. I would do the same thing down below if you need to, but most cases, if it's like a family that you're not going to basically extend this beyond the reference level 1, you don't have to pin it. But certain cases you would have to do it because let's say for example you want a column that goes from this to this height, but you want to have this column penetrating down below, then you have to create a reference plane, say go to the bottom because you want that extension. Okay, sometimes you have to do that, but most cases I just say don't bother. All right. Now when I talk about like the like here, like now you can define material. So what here you can do is that you can just click on this and say this is material. Okay, and subcategory, you could do it. Right now this is, I think it's a furniture. So what I'm going to do is that I'm just going to call this table. Okay, you can define it. You can say, okay, how much you want. I would just say, let's say make it 2. You can put it whatever color you want. You can put in like define a color, default color. I was going to say default wall and just make it brown.
So those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 line weights, those are scaled at different scales already.
That's correct. That's correct. Now 1 and 2, those basically furniture falls under 1 or 2 depending on how you want like your furniture to punch out. By default it should be 1, so I'll just leave it 2 just to showcase. You can make it darker if you need to. Okay, right now just set it to 3.
So these aren't actually by line styles? There's no actual style?
There's no style.
So it won't show up as a style when you import this family in?
Yes.
Okay.
This one just tells you that, okay, this is the table. If you have a subcategory, you can override it inside the project. So whatever overrides in the project, this doesn't matter. Okay, this one just a setup, right? Just a setup that it's a default. You could say, okay, I want it to be 12. You can set this to 12 and then go back there and change it to 3. Okay, it doesn't matter.
Do we have a standard in the office for, like I know our template has lines and then we have extra thin lines which are actually thicker and
Mhm.
lines.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have thin lines, which are between lines and extra thin lines.
Oh, okay.
Anyway.
Yeah.
And then there's, but like, I just wonder if we have a standard for like, you know, what's a profile line, what's a cut line through
Oh, I
a
see.
major structural component, what's
Sure.
a cut line through a furniture.
Mm-hmm. Yes and no, but the thing is the majority of my line weights is all depends on what AIA, whether people adopts to AIA. Currently there is none, right? But the thing is that you have to keep in mind the line weights. I want to reduce it as much as possible. You want to have five, at least five, but no more than that, because the more you get into it, the more you have to manage. It's like, forget it.
So Revit gives us what, 9, I think?
16
16
different type.
thicknesses.
Yes.
Weights.
Yeah. But I think that's plenty. You don't need
Yeah.
more than 5.
Yeah.
But you know,
We don't know which 5.
Yeah, exactly. So you just define it
standards.
basically.
Just
Yeah.
change it for every
Yeah.
moment, basically.
Okay. So
Okay, no standard.
no standard, but that's fine. We're just gonna basically just do it as we go,
Okay.
improving it, because the thing is that it's all about user feedback. Okay, we want everybody to have as much feedback as possible, and just to get that ball rolling. Okay, you have a table, and what you can do is that you can basically set that to tables. Okay, there we go. Pretty simple. Now in this visibility, here you could say, okay, I want to show up, but right now I'm just going to turn on. In here, the graphics override, when you click on this, you see that here you got plan, front, back, left, and right. You notice that there's a course level. Here, I'm just going to say, okay, show me this particular table at the course level. Okay? Now what we're going to do is that we're going to add more to this. So we're going to add like a table counter, and a couple legs. Okay? So what we're going to do is I'm just going to add a parameter. Okay? Very simple. And in here, I always say, let's say 50. Come on, escape button, it's not working. Oh, there you go. Here, I'm just gonna say counter thickness. Okay, and then the legs, I'm just gonna basically put in. So with this, come on, I'm gonna, if the dimension doesn't show up, okay, there is a button right here. It's called the active dimensions. So if you, let's say if you select that object is not showing up, just click on one of this button right there. So here I'm just gonna say 100, 100. Just keep it the same, 100 and 100. Pretty standard stuff. And next I'm gonna just say, add that in, add that in, add that in, and then select that and say leg thickness. Okay. Now the next thing you want to do is that you want objects to not interfere with other objects. So it's always a good idea to basically turn off the original objects so that you only get the frame. Okay? It's a good practice because what happens is that whenever you select the objects and you have another object interfering, sometimes it will not click onto it. Okay, in this particular case, I'm just going to draw it very quickly. So draw your rectangle. Okay, finish. Now I like to do it individually. You could do this. Okay, like that.
Do you lock it to the reference
No,
plane?
you don't have to. Because once you snap it to a reference plane
It just knows to lock.
it's locked now.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Now you could do this, but I would never do this. You know, do you know the reason why? Okay. The problem with Revit is that as this dimension gets closer and closer together, if that leg touches that leg, Revit will not create the object because it's interfering. Because something to keep in mind is that if you're building a family, if you have anything interfering with another like another objects, Revit just quits. Just say, no, I cannot do it. That's one thing to keep in mind. But for this exercise, I'm just going to do it quickly because of that time constraint. But when I build family, that's how I would think about it. Just do not cross-reference. So I will build this each individual objects. Okay, let's do it quickly, and then I'm just gonna say, okay, lock to the underside of that. Okay, and then finally I'm just gonna turn this off. And just draw from here to there. And here I'm just gonna go to front elevation. Again, I'm just gonna turn off all the other secondary objects, just hide it, so no interference. Okay, good idea that you should not have any interference, and then just lock it, and lock it. Okay, once you have that, you're gonna have this sort of like objects that's the same, and then you can say, okay, this is the table. The material, I'm just gonna use the same. The only difference is that I do not want this to show up in course. Okay? Now let's try this out. So I'm gonna load it in to a project. Okay? So by default, that's what it's gonna look like. If it's that's what it's gonna look like. But once I turn that to course, it looks like a box. Okay? So that's basically how you do it. You just basically built upon that particular box. If you know how to do the box, that's fine. That's all you need, right? And then you just basically build on that detail. Yeah. Any questions so far with this? Pretty simple? Yeah, sorry about that. I just got a delay. I don't think Seattle's calling in.
I'm asking too many questions to
Yeah,
slow you down, sorry.
That's fine, that's fine. But the thing is that I'm going to make this recording available to everybody, and then hopefully this works. Yeah, it's still going. So no question. Okay, thank you.